She was pregnant, trapped in a deadly web of lies and betrayal. But when her affair is exposed, it leads to a shocking turn of events that no one could have predicted. How far will a woman go to escape a love turned deadly? Stay with us until the end to uncover the chilling truth behind her survival and the dark secret that led to her life-or-death escape. The air in the mineshaft was damp and heavy. A faint metallic tang lingered in the back of her throat. Her flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows on the jagged walls. She paused, listening to the echo of her own breath. Far above, the world felt distant, almost unreal. The chill bit at her skin, but sweat trickled down her neck. The silence down here wasn't pure. It buzzed with a low hum. She wasn't supposed to be here. This was his secret. The man who loved her. The man she thought she knew. But she had followed the whispers, and they had led her here. A faint sound made her freeze, a scrape, then a thud. She gripped the flashlight tighter, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling, swallowed by the abyss. The darkness seemed to lean in, closer, almost suffocating. She moved forward, each step crunching on loose gravel. The air grew colder. Her fingers brushed the wall for balance, finding it damp and gritty. A shape loomed ahead, a pile of something unnatural. Her flashlight revealed a tattered shoe. Her stomach lurched. It was hers. The same shoe she'd seen on the woman. The one who smiled too easily. The one he claimed was just a friend. She stumbled back, her breath catching in short, sharp gasps. Her mind raced, replaying moments she had ignored. Late-night calls. Excuses. The lingering scent of perfume that wasn't hers. And now this. A glint caught her eye. Metal, sharp and cruel, partly buried in the dirt. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. A blade, smeared and rusted, its edge darkened with time. She dropped it, the clatter echoing like a scream that wasn't hers. She spun around. The darkness behind her was alive, breathing, watching. Then came the voice. Low, calm, and too close. "You weren't supposed to find this." Her breath hitched, the voice sending a shiver down her spine. She turned, the flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam danced over the uneven walls, revealing nothing but shadows. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over her pounding heart. No response, just the quiet hum of the mineshaft. The darkness seemed thicker now, oppressive, as if closing in on her. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. "You couldn't leave it alone, could you?" The voice came again, smooth and measured. It wasn't far, it was everywhere. She swung the flashlight wildly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Show yourself," she demanded, though her voice cracked. A soft chuckle echoed, bouncing off the walls, distorting in the void. "I loved you," the voice continued. "I tried to protect you from this." The flashlight caught movement, a shadow slipping just out of sight. "Stay away from me," she shouted, the sound breaking apart in the emptiness. Her pulse roared in her ears as she stumbled backward, her foot catching on a loose rock. She fell hard, the flashlight skittering from her grasp, plunging her into near-total darkness. She scrambled to grab it, her fingers brushing the cold, gritty floor. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Getting closer. The light flickered back on, and she pointed it frantically into the void. There he was. His face partially obscured by shadow, but his eyes, those eyes she once loved, were cold and unrecognizable. Her husband. "You don't understand," he said, his tone soft, almost pleading. "She meant nothing to me." Her mind reeled, pieces clicking into place. The woman. The lies. The hidden anger simmering beneath his charming facade. "You killed her," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "I didn't have a choice," he said. You weren't supposed to find out. Tears blurred her vision as she scrambled to her feet. You monster, she spat, her voice shaking. His smile was faint, almost sad. I did it for us, he murmured, taking another step. The flashlight dimmed. The battery was dying. Her only lifeline to the world above was fading fast. And so was her hope. The flashlight sputtered, its weak beam flickering like a heartbeat about to stop. Her trembling hands clenched around it, desperate to hold on to the light. His footsteps echoed louder now, each one a reminder of how close he was. You don't have to do this, she pleaded, backing away, her voice thin and shaking. But the walls felt narrower with every step, pressing her closer to him. I already did, he replied, his tone void of remorse. She blinked, her vision swimming in the dim light, struggling to process his words. The air felt thicker, colder. Her lungs burned with each shallow breath. You don't get it, he continued, almost conversationally. She threatened everything. His face emerged fully from the shadows now, pale and twisted in the faint glow. The man she married, the father of her unborn child, was a stranger. You loved her, she accused, her voice breaking. He paused, his expression darkening. I loved you, he said sharply, his tone laced with venom. That's why I had to end it. She didn't matter. The room spun as his words dug into her, each one sharper than the blade she'd seen. Her hands instinctively went to her stomach, cradling the life she carried. What about us? She whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. His gaze dropped for a moment, softening just enough to make her heart lurch. But when he looked up again, the coldness had returned. There's no us if you tell anyone, he said quietly, stepping closer. Her back hit the jagged wall, the flashlight slipping from her grasp. It rolled, spinning its dying light across the dirt floor. Her breath caught as his shadow loomed over her, monstrous in the flickering glow. Don't do this, she begged, her voice hoarse. His hand reached for something behind him, a glint of metal, familiar and deadly. You shouldn't have come here, he murmured, almost regretfully. The flashlight died, and the darkness swallowed her scream. The blackness was absolute, pressing in from all sides. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out everything else. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement. Just her own frantic breaths. Then a rustle. A scrape of metal against stone. She flinched, every nerve screaming. Why fight it? His voice whispered, close, too close. She dropped to her knees, hands scrambling across the cold, uneven ground. Her fingers brushed over the flashlight, but it was lifeless, a useless shell in the darkness. She needed to move, but the air felt thick, like molasses, weighing her down. Her palms pressed into the gravel, pushing herself forward blindly. The sound of his boots followed, deliberate and steady. You should have trusted me, he said, his tone calm, almost conversational. Her stomach churned with terror, bile rising in her throat. Please, she rasped, her voice barely audible. She reached out, her hand catching the rough edge of the mineshaft wall. It was cold and slick, grounding her in this nightmare. You were supposed to love me, he continued, his words slicing through the darkness. The clang of metal on stone rang out again, sending a jolt through her body. She crawled faster, her fingers bleeding as they scraped against the jagged floor. Then she felt it, a cool rush of air ahead, faint but real. A way out. Her chest tightened with a spark of hope, fragile and fleeting. But then he spoke again, closer now. You can't outrun the truth. The sound of his footsteps quickened. Her heart seized, panic taking over. She stumbled to her feet, her legs trembling as she broke into a blind run. The air seemed to thin, each breath harder to draw. Her foot caught on something, a loose rail, a piece of debris. She fell hard, her hands breaking her fall but sending a shock of pain up her arms. Behind her, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. Then came his voice, low and dripping with menace. Game over. The sound of a match striking echoed in the void. A small, flickering flame illuminated his face, the knife glinting in his hand. Her blood ran cold as she realized he wasn't just holding the blade. He was holding a matchbook, and the faint scent of gasoline now surrounded her. The sharp, acrid scent of gasoline filled her nostrils, cutting through the damp, musty air. Her mind raced, piecing together the horror of his plan. The trail she'd followed, the strange, wet patches on the ground, wasn't water. It was fuel. She scrambled backward, her palms slipping on the gritty floor. His shadow flickered in the dim, dancing light of the match. "You always wanted answers," he said softly, almost mockingly. "Now you've found them." The flame wavered in his hand, reflecting in his cold, unblinking eyes. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as she pressed herself against the wall. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "You don't have to do this." He tilted his head, studying her as though weighing her plea. "It's already done," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. With a flick of his wrist, the match arced through the air. She watched, paralyzed, as it fell, spinning in slow motion. The moment it hit the ground, the fuel ignited, flames roaring to life. The fire spread rapidly, a wall of searing heat and light consuming the darkness. The shadows twisted and danced, the orange glow illuminating his face in grotesque detail. Her lungs burned as smoke filled the narrow shaft, thick and choking. She coughed, her body heaving as she struggled to breathe. The heat was unbearable, blistering her skin as she shielded her face with her arms. "Why?" she cried, her voice cracking, raw with desperation. He stood there, watching her unmoving. "Because I couldn't lose you," he said simply. His words, calm and measured, cut deeper than any blade. The flames surged, licking at the walls, consuming everything in their path. She forced herself to move, staggering to her feet. Her vision blurred from the smoke, her lungs screaming for air. She stumbled blindly, her hands outstretched, searching for an escape. But the fire had spread too fast, trapping her in a ring of searing heat. Behind her, his laughter echoed, hollow and haunting. And then she heard it, a faint rumble. The ground beneath her trembled, a deep, resonant groan. The fire had weakened the structure. The mine was collapsing. The rumble grew louder, vibrating through the walls, the floor, and her very bones. Dust rained from the ceiling, mixing with the choking smoke that clung to the air. The fire crackled violently, its roar competing with the groan of the mine's instability. Her legs buckled, but sheer terror forced her forward. Her hands scraped against the jagged wall as she clawed for balance. Somewhere behind her, his laughter stopped. "Wait," he called, his voice rising in sudden panic. The ground gave a violent lurch, throwing her forward onto her knees. She coughed, her throat raw, her lungs aching with every shallow breath. "Help me," he shouted now, his calm, menacing tone replaced by fear. She turned her head just enough to see him, his face lit by the flickering flames. Rocks began to fall, crashing around him, sparks flying as they struck the ground. He stumbled, his confident posture replaced by desperation. A beam cracked above him with a deafening snap, splintering in a shower of wood and debris. He dove, but not fast enough. The beam slammed down, pinning his leg beneath its weight. His scream cut through the chaos, raw and guttural. Her instincts told her to run, to leave him there, to escape the collapsing hell he had created. But something in her hesitated, a cruel, lingering thread of the love she once felt. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Don't leave me." Her chest heaved as she stared at him, the firelight casting grotesque shadows on his face. For a brief moment, She saw the man she thought she knew, the man she had married. But then her eyes fell to the knife, still clutched in his hand, its blade glinting in the firelight. She staggered backward, shaking her head. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. His face twisted, fury replacing fear. "You think you're safe without me?" he spat, his voice venomous despite his agony. "You'll never escape this." The ceiling groaned again, louder, more insistent. Chunks of rock rained down, one narrowly missing her as she stumbled away. She turned, her body screaming in protest, and ran toward the faint rush of air she had felt before. Behind her, his screams turned to curses, then to silence as the rumble reached its peak. The mine began to collapse in earnest, the sound deafening, a cacophony of destruction. And as she ran, the heat at her back and the smoke in her lungs, she realized she was racing not just for her life, but for the life growing inside her. The ground beneath her feet was unstable, shifting with every step. Her legs burned, her lungs felt like they were collapsing under the weight of the smoke. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The faint, cool draft ahead was her only promise of survival. Behind her, the deafening crash of falling rock swallowed everything, the fire, his screams, even her thoughts. The mine was coming down, piece by piece, and she was running out of time. The heat chased her, scorching her back, pushing her forward with a force as relentless as her fear. She tripped, her hands hitting the ground hard, but she scrambled up again. The rough, jagged walls tore at her skin as she groped for balance. Her ears rang from the relentless noise, and her vision blurred from the smoke. But then there it was, a break in the suffocating darkness. A faint glow ahead, dim but real. She pushed harder, her muscles screaming as she moved toward it. The air became fresher, cooler with every desperate step. She stumbled through the opening, collapsing onto cold, damp earth. The sky above was a muted gray, tinged with the soft light of dawn. For a moment, she just lay there, her body trembling, her chest heaving as she sucked in gulps of clean air. The silence outside was eerie after the chaos inside, but it was broken by a distant, muffled roar as the last of the mine collapsed in on itself. The ground beneath her shook slightly, a final tremor as if the earth was swallowing its secrets whole. She turned her head, looking back at the gaping black maw of the mineshaft. It was sealed now, buried under tons of rock and fire. Her hands instinctively went to her stomach, cradling it as tears streamed down her soot-streaked face. He was gone. The danger was gone. But the scars of what had happened would never truly leave her. The cool morning air whispered around her, carrying with it a strange mix of relief and grief. She sat there for a long time, staring at the horizon, as the first light of day began to creep across the sky. The faint light of dawn painted the world in soft hues, a stark contrast to the chaos she had just escaped. Her body ached, every movement a reminder of how close she had been to death. She sat there, knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped protectively around her stomach. The child she carried was her only anchor now, a fragile hope amid the ruin of her life. The mineshaft entrance was silent, sealed beneath layers of rock and ash. The flames and the man who started them were gone, buried in the darkness forever. She closed her eyes, the image of his face burned into her mind, both the man she had loved and the monster he had become. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth, but her senses were dulled by exhaustion and lingering fear. The world felt surreal, almost dreamlike, as if she had stepped into a different reality. A sound broke her thoughts, a bird chirping softly in the distance. It was a sound she hadn't heard in what felt like an eternity. It grounded her, reminded her that life existed beyond the nightmare she had just endured. She forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. Her hands were raw and bleeding, dirt embedded in every scrape, but she barely felt the pain. She looked around, trying to orient herself in the unfamiliar terrain. The forest stretched out before her, dense and foreboding, but somewhere out there was safety. Help. Hope. She took a shaky step forward, then another, her mind replaying the events in fragmented flashes. His voice low and menacing. The flames, hungrily consuming everything in their path. The knife. The moment she left him behind. She pushed the memories aside, focusing on the path ahead. Her survival wasn't just for herself now. It was for the child she carried, the life that had given her the strength to escape. The forest loomed large, its shadows long and shifting in the early morning light. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Each step was painful, her body screaming for rest, but she moved forward with a determination she didn't know she had. She was free now, but freedom came with a cost, a truth she would carry with her forever. The truth of what she had seen, what she had done, and the haunting knowledge that love could turn so quickly into something unrecognizable. The bird chirped again, its song distant yet persistent, as if urging her forward. She listened, her step steadying, her heart heavy but resolute. She was alive, and for now that was enough. The forest was alive with sound, but every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made her flinch. Her senses were on high alert, her mind trapped in the echoes of the nightmare she had escaped. The path was uneven, winding through thick undergrowth and gnarled tree roots. She stumbled often, her hands catching on branches, the bark scraping her raw palms. The sunlight, filtering weakly through the canopy above, felt like a distant promise, a world she wasn't sure she belonged to anymore. Her thoughts churned as she walked, heavy and disjointed. She replayed the moment she left him behind, pinned under the beam, his voice shifting from pleas to curses. Guilt warred with relief, a storm of emotions she couldn't untangle. She had loved him once, and now she hated him as much as she feared him. But beneath the fear and anger, a quieter thought stirred. What if she had done more to stop this? Her hands moved instinctively to her stomach again, grounding her. The life inside her was innocent, untouched by the horrors of that mineshaft. She needed to protect it, even if the cost was carrying the weight of this day forever. The forest began to thin, the trees giving way to a rocky clearing. In the distance, she spotted a dirt road cutting through the wilderness. Her breath caught in her throat, a flicker of hope sparking to life. She quickened her pace, her legs protesting with every step. When she reached the road, she collapsed onto the rough gravel, tears streaming down her face. It was a lifeline, a connection to the world she thought she had lost. Farther down the road, the faint hum of an engine reached her ears. She pushed herself up, waving her arms desperately. The sound grew louder, a rusty pickup truck emerging around the bend. The driver, an older man with weathered features, slowed as he approached. He stepped out, concern etched into his face. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice rough but kind. The question hung in the air, and for a moment, she didn't know how to answer. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but no words came. Instead, she reached for him, clutching his arm like a lifeline. "It's okay," he said softly, helping her into the truck. "You're safe now." As the truck rumbled to life and pulled away, she glanced back toward the forest. The clearing disappeared behind the trees, swallowed by the wilderness. And with it, the horrors she had left behind. She turned forward, the road stretching ahead, uncertain but full of possibility. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to breathe. The truck rumbled steadily along the winding road, its engine the only sound in the otherwise still morning. The man didn't ask her anything more. He must have seen the fear in her eyes, the blankness in her face. She sat in silence, her hands gripping her stomach, as if holding onto the life inside her would keep her tethered to the reality she had almost lost. The dust from the road settled in the air, heavy and thick. She watched it drift lazily in the truck's rearview mirror, a foggy reflection of the world she had left behind. Her mind was a blur of memories and emotions, the image of her husband's face, the man who had destroyed everything she had ever believed in, still haunting her. Her fingers trembled, and she quickly wiped away the tears she hadn't even realized were falling. The man glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly, but he didn't ask her what happened. Maybe he knew. Maybe he didn't need to know. There was no need to explain the terror, the lies, the betrayal. There was no need to relive it. The road stretched on, each mile taking her farther from the mine, from her past. Eventually, the truck began to slow, passing a small town with little more than a few scattered houses and a gas station. The man turned to her, his face softening. "Where do you want me to take you?" he asked, his voice gentle but filled with quiet concern. She hesitated. The possibilities before her seemed endless and overwhelming. A new life, a fresh start. But where? What was she even capable of now? Her eyes flicked to the horizon, where the sun had just begun to rise fully, casting a soft, golden light over the land. For the first time since it all began, she felt something stir inside her, something fragile, but undeniable. Hope. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking in a deep, shaky breath. I don't know," she said softly. The man nodded, not pressing her, understanding that sometimes there are no answers right away. "We'll figure it out," he said simply, pulling off the main road and slowing down as they approached a small, humble diner. She glanced up at the faded sign and then back at the man. "Thank you," she whispered. He smiled, nodding. "No need to thank me. I'm just glad you're safe." The truck stopped, and for the first time in hours, she stepped out onto solid ground, away from the nightmare, away from the fear. The diner seemed peaceful, almost inviting, as though it could offer her a moment of peace. She looked around, feeling the weight of everything she had just been through. And in that quiet moment, with the sun rising behind her, she realized something. She was still here. And whatever came next, she would face it, because she had survived. She stood in front of the diner, the cool morning air brushing against her face, grounding her. The hum of the small town seemed almost surreal after the chaos she had endured. A deep breath in, her chest ached as she filled her lungs with fresh air, free from the smoke and the fire. The man from the truck didn't say anything more. He simply nodded and walked back to his vehicle, leaving her standing there with her thoughts. She watched him disappear down the street, and for a brief moment, it felt like the world had frozen. The noise of life, people talking, cars driving by, the faint buzz of a radio from the diner, seemed so distant. Her feet moved without her consent, pulling her toward the diner's door. She didn't know why she was here, but her body led her inside anyway, as if this place held some kind of comfort. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside, and the warm air hit her face, along with the smell of coffee and pancakes. The diner was small, cozy, and filled with the soft murmur of conversation. A few elderly patrons sat by the window, their mugs of coffee steaming as they chatted in low tones. Behind the counter, a waitress with an apron smiled as she wiped a glass clean. "Morning," the waitress greeted, her voice warm and welcoming. The sound of normal life was jarring after everything, but at the same time, it was a balm to her raw soul. She took a seat at the counter, her hands still trembling slightly as she clasped them together, trying to stop the shaking. The waitress came over, her pen ready. "What can I get you, Han?" She stared at the menu, but the words blurred together. She wasn't hungry, but her mind needed something to latch onto, something to focus on. "I'll have a coffee," she said, her voice quieter than she expected. The waitress nodded, scribbling it down. "Coming right up," she said with a smile, before walking off to fill the order. Her fingers curled around the cold counter, grounding herself. The light outside had shifted. It was full daylight now. She glanced out the window at the town beyond. A new day had begun. Her heart thudded in her chest, and the weight of everything, the lies, the betrayal, the fear, settled into her bones again. But it was different now. The storm inside her was quieter, more controlled. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to simply sit, to breathe, and to be. The waitress returned with her coffee, setting the steaming cup in front of her. "Here you go," she said gently. "Thank you," she murmured, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. The steam rose up in delicate swirls, filling her senses. She took a sip, the bitterness of the coffee pulling her further into the present. For a moment, she closed her eyes, savoring the warmth. And in that simple moment, a small part of her believed that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. A life not defined by the horror she had escaped, but by the quiet strength that had gotten her this far. The warmth of the coffee seeped into her bones, grounding her, calming the whirlwind inside her mind. For the first time since she had fled the mine, she allowed herself to sit still. To breathe. The quiet hum of the diner felt like a cocoon, wrapping around her, shielding her from the storm that still raged in her thoughts. She glanced around the room, taking in the simplicity of the place, the chipped mugs, the worn booths, the old jukebox tucked in the corner. Nothing about this moment was extraordinary, but it was exactly what she needed. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, came by again to check on her. "Anything else?" she asked, her voice soft and genuine. She shook her head, offering a faint smile. "No, I'm okay," she said. The waitress smiled in return, leaving her in peace. The coffee grew colder as she sat there, but she didn't mind. She stared into the mug, her fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly, lost in thought. What now? Where would she go? How would she rebuild? She glanced at her reflection in the window, her face streaked with dirt, her hair a tangled mess. She looked like someone who had just barely survived. And in a way she had. She had escaped a man who had once vowed to love her, only to destroy everything in his wake. But now she was free. Free to choose what came next, even if she had no idea what that was. A thought lingered in her mind, soft but persistent. She had a future now. For the first time in a long time, she felt a small spark of hope. Maybe she could start over, somewhere far from the ruins of her past. Maybe she could give her child the life they both deserved, one filled with peace, safety, and love. Her fingers rested over her stomach once again. For the child. For herself. She couldn't change what had happened, couldn't undo the past. But she could build something new. Slowly, she stood, feeling the heaviness of her body, but also the strength she'd found in the process of surviving. The waitress gave her a knowing smile as she paid for the coffee, her expression kind, understanding. "Take care of yourself, Han," she said softly. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady despite the turbulence still roiling inside her. As she stepped out of the diner and into the sunlight, she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, but also a lightness she hadn't expected. The road ahead was uncertain, but she was alive. And in this moment, that was enough. She took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill her lungs, and began walking. One step at a time. The road ahead seemed endless, yet somehow, with each step, she felt herself pulling farther from the past and closer to whatever might lie ahead. The sun hung low in the sky now, casting long shadows across the road as she walked with slow, measured steps. The world around her felt quiet, but her mind was still a battlefield. Flashes of her former life, the pain of betrayal, and the weight of the decision she had made, leaving him behind. But the child inside her, her precious child, was her anchor. It was all that mattered now. She paused for a moment, her hand gently resting on her stomach. The baby shifted beneath her skin, a soft reminder of the life she had to protect. There was no turning back. The din of traffic in the distance began to grow louder, and soon she found herself at the edge of a small town. She didn't know where she was headed, but something told her she had to keep moving. She could feel the eyes of strangers on her as she walked through the town's main street, but it didn't matter. They didn't know her. They didn't know the weight of the life she carried inside. She passed the gas station, the small grocery store, and the quiet houses lined along the street. Everything felt normal, peaceful even, as if nothing had changed. But she had changed. The woman who had walked into the diner hours ago was gone, replaced by someone harder, more wary. She reached a small park, where a few children played on swings and a couple sat on a bench, enjoying the last few moments of daylight. The sight made her pause, her throat tight with emotion. She had no family left. She had no one but herself and the life she was carrying. But maybe that was enough. She could start over. There had to be a place in this world where she could rebuild, where she could breathe again without fear. And so, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, she took another step. And then another. The future remained uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let the past destroy her.
Not now.
Not ever. The air had cooled by the time she reached the outskirts of the town. The sky above was painted in hues of orange and purple, the last light of day slipping away like a memory she couldn't hold on to. With each step, she felt the weight of the journey she had made. The miles walked, the pain endured, the pieces of herself she had left behind. But she was still here. And that, in itself, was something worth holding on to. The streets of the town were quiet now, the shadows growing long as night crept closer. She found herself standing at the edge of a small, simple house, a place that, for reasons she couldn't explain, felt right. It was nothing extraordinary. A two-story structure with a peeling paint job and a little garden at the front, but to her it looked like hope, a fresh start. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. But then, with quiet determination, she walked up to the door, her hand resting on the worn doorknob. She knocked once, the sound sharp and final in the still evening air. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with kind, welcoming eyes. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice gentle and warm. The woman standing on the doorstep swallowed hard, her mind racing for the right words. I need a place to stay," she said softly, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. The older woman studied her for a moment, her gaze lingering on her face, then her eyes softened. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. And in that moment she knew. She knew that whatever had happened, whatever had been left behind, was not the end of her story. It was merely a chapter. The future still held unknowns, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. She stepped inside, the warmth of the house enveloping her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to exhale. The door closed behind her, and the weight of the world seemed to lift, if only for a moment. It wasn't over. It was only just beginning.